Seismic new developments in the Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption saga. Nearly 4 years after these savage slayings shocked the nation, another arrest has been made. Only this time, the individual in hot water is one of the ones responsible for administering justice in that case. Also, the voice of an accused killer. We're going to take you in depth on a second interview with Brandon Barnes, who stands accused of murdering his late wife, Jessica Barnes, in Pendleton, South Carolina. I'm Will Folks, the owner and founding editor of FITSNews.com. We've got a big episode of the Week in Review coming at you now. All right, so it is an honor to have back on the set this week one of our favorite attorneys here in South Carolina, Lauren Taylor from Lauren Taylor Law. And for those of you who are new to FITSNews coverage of the Murdoch saga, Lauren was absolutely indispensable last January during the big evidentiary hearing, which really has set the stage for a lot of what we're going to talk about today as we deal with the recent arrest of Becky Hill, the former clerk of Colleton County, who was responsible allegedly for tampering with the jury that found Alec Murdoch guilty of the murder of his wife and son back in the summer of 2021. Lauren, I got to ask you, when we were breaking down this case last January and you went through all of those court rulings that were so central to the notion of jury tampering and which standard would be used and how the court might interpret the arguments that were made, obviously Alec Murdoch came up short on his first bid for a new trial. But as we look at the developments now with Becky Hill and her arrest, I got to ask you, let's start with this baseline question before we dive into all the details. Is Alec Murdoch going to get a new trial? Are you at 50% yes, 75% yes? Are you all the way 100% at this point?
You know, that's the question that if I had a lottery ticket and I knew the answer, I'd be a very wealthy woman. I think it's still developing, but I definitely think the chances have gone up substantially since yesterday's developments. While they are loosely related to the Murdoch murder trial, they're not all related to that. So I think that's an important distinction. So right now, Ms. Hill is looking at, I believe, a total of 4 charges, one of which is the perjury charge, which actually stemmed from that January hearing last year where Justice Toll asked her if she had made sealed evidence available to any members of the press. On the record, she answered no. That was then found to be untrue based on some evidence that had been made part of the record a year before. The next charge is obstruction of justice. There's several elements to that charge. Some are common law. Basically, it can amount to several things and what she's doing within the scope of her duties as the clerk of court. So obviously writing a book and profiting off of it and using, knowledge or information that she might not have otherwise had minus her position as being the clerk of court. That's something that could be seen as obstructing justice. And then there's the other 2 charges, which are a little bit more alarming, I think, to those of us who were really solely focused on Ms. Hill under the Murdaugh scope. These relate to mismanagement and misfeasance of public funding. So there were some federal grants that were awarded to Colleton County specifically, and it appears from the context of the warrants that were released yesterday that they're alleging that Ms. Hill, I believe it was like $9,800 for one of them that she personally benefited from. And then there was another $2,000 transaction that was cut for her personally, Becky Hill, from the clerk of court's active account. So I think, we're obviously hearing statements from all of the attorneys that were on the first case and some attorneys that are representing the jurors that are involved here. My biggest red flag with all of this, and I think, I made my opinions clear that I thought there was enough back in January of last year to warrant a second trial. But when you're looking at someone who has the power that a clerk of court does, now a lot of us have only been exposed to her in this sense of a murder trial. She has so many more duties that are unrelated to trying murder cases. There are family court cases that go through the clerk of court's office. There's child support obligations, DSS hearings, criminal cases, bond cases, passports. There's a lot of money that goes through that office, and there's a lot of responsibility that's put on that elected official. So if she is tampering with that, and these warrants list passport offices, things like that, my argument is going to be this woman has been using her position of power, an elected position at that, to have her way with this small town courthouse. And if that's the case, my biggest concern isn't how she answered Judge Toll's questions back in January of last year. It comes back to the egg juror. So if she is, getting her hands in all of these pots and, creating these issues from the beginning, even before Murdaugh case was happening, then what's to stop her from, tampering with a potential juror on the day that deliberation is about to start because she has some feeling that that juror may or may not vote in the way that she wants them to. And I think the Supreme Court is going to have to really look at that. And I believe Joe McCullough is the one that is representing the egg juror. So that's going to be, at least an argument that if I was Dick, I would be bringing that up. It's a difference if the juror had never been excused and we call all those jurors back in and they all give that same testimony minus juror Z, I believe, that did say, I was impacted by Ms. Hill's statements to me. So if we take all that in and all those jurors still, render that verdict of saying, no, it was harmless contact, I was not affected, it did not sway my verdict, that's irrelevant when we now add in the fact that there was one person who was sat on that jury, questioned by the judge, selected by the defense and the prosecution, and but for Ms. Hill, possibly was not allowed to enter that jury room and render a verdict.
When you mentioned the egg juror a moment ago, and specifically that theory that she had been targeted because she was a holdout, because she wouldn't secretly tell the clerk of court that she was a guilty vote, that's exactly what she's alleged in her book, Myra Crosby, the egg juror. In fact, she specifically claimed that there was a broader conspiracy to target her because they had basically sussed out that she was undecided. And so the fact that there are potential jury rigging allegations here, in addition to the jury tampering, which was documented in that hearing. But Lauren, let me ask you this question. Are you surprised that in these 4 charges against Becky Hill, there's nothing related to jury tampering?
I think it's a delicate question because we only had one juror that answered, in the affirmative that the statement, well, I think there was one other one that did say the statement was made, but she answered that it did not affect her verdict. So in that sense, there might just be a little bit more digging to do. Also, keep in mind that if you're the state and you're arguing, to the Supreme Court that this was a fair trial, this was harmless contact, there is absolutely no need to put the state and the taxpayers through the need to retry this case, you're not going to want to roll out charges of jury tampering against your clerk of court because it kind of cuts your nose off to spite your face a little bit when you're saying, hey, everything was great. We're not even charging her for any of this harmless contact, which I think is the crux that Judge Toll leaned on, during her determination and what the case law dictates. Now that we have this whole other can of worms opened, it's going to make their position in that argument a little bit more difficult. South Carolina hated how much attention this case got on a national level. No one, including all of the Supreme Court justices, want to try this case again. However, I think, I get questions all the time from people that are like, well, he's spending the rest of his life in federal prison. What is the difference? Why do we care? Well, unfortunately, Dick gave a great interview when he was talking about his book that I personally loved. And I've had this question before, guilty people need legal representation. And it's really important in this state, whether you're someone that's as famous or infamous as Alex Murdaugh, that you have the same rights as everyone else. And, whether he's guilty of a financial crime is a very different thing than whether he's guilty of the murder of his wife and his son. And I think, in the legal community, up until Alex took the stand, there was still a good chatter among us that this could be a hung jury, or at the very least, it could be a mistrial. A lot of the evidence, I think, overwhelmed jurors. It was a little confusing at times. A lot of it came in later than they were expecting, and they didn't have the full amount of time they would have liked to have really put together some compelling visuals, specifically with the car data. I think that lost some jurors a little bit along the way. But to me, once I sat down and understood it, that was almost as much of a nail in the coffin as the video from Paul's phone. But I think, with all of that, no one wants to redo this. But it almost has to be done when you have someone that is an elected official that is putting her fingers into things that are constitutionally protected rights.
Exactly, and you mentioned it earlier, Alec Murdaugh's right to Sixth Amendment protection is the same as yours or mine or anyone out there. And we've consistently argued here at FITSNews anyway that once you determine that his Sixth Amendment rights were violated during the trial, at that point, that's the ball game. And I felt after that evidentiary hearing last January that bar, which was set by Justice Toll, former Chief Justice Toll, a very high bar, which a lot of folks even argued she set the bar too high. But I felt at that hearing that they cleared it, Lauren. But let me ask you this. You mentioned that, Becky Hill, none of these charges are necessarily related to the jury tampering. And so it feels like prosecutors and investigators are trying to keep the inquiry focused on things that don't involve the verdict. But let me ask you this. How does a prosecutor stand up and argue that Becky Hill should be taken at her word that she didn't tamper when they are prosecuting her for perjury on another matter? Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, I would not want to be the one that has to make that argument. I think it goes to the truth of the matter. If you will lie on a televised evidentiary hearing that is conducted by the former Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court, you can't tell me you're not going to tell a lie behind a closed door when you don't think anyone's listening. And I think that's going to be what the state is going to have to inevitably, we'll see what the strategy is that they develop. I'm sure they'll get crafty with it, but I would not be the one or be wanting to be the one to make that argument in front of a judge. I think it's full of obvious holes.
Well, there's so many loose ends here to this story. Obviously, the Becky Hill component of it, we've seen some charges. That investigation is ongoing. We don't know whether there will be additional charges. We've also got the case of Curtis Eddie Smith hanging out there, Alec Murdaugh's drug dealer, allegedly, his check casher, allegedly, charges against him just sort of hanging out there. No one really knows what to expect of that case, where it's going. But also we've got other elements of Alec Murdaugh's appeal. In fact, he's challenging some of the phone data which forms the basis for the state's timeline. They're basically saying that evidence and testimony that was admitted, which helped law enforcement and prosecutors establish that timeline for Alec Murdaugh's guilt, they're now saying that that's out of the window based on the arguments made in the appeal. Is all of this, though, basically a jury tampering issue, though, Lauren, or do you feel that some of the other elements of Murdaugh's appeal could potentially tilt the scale toward a new trial?
I think Judge Newman was really great in really taking the time to consider what evidence he was going to allow in. He knew that this case was going to be ripe for an appeal regardless of the outcome, likely. So I don't know that it's so much of an evidentiary issue, but the defense is absolutely going to hang their hat on the Becky Hill thing and use whatever they can to essentially get a new slate, right? Because at that point, they can remake motion arguments for motions in limine to exclude certain evidence. I think in a second trial, it's typically easier for the prosecution going forward because they kind of already have an idea of what the defense's strategy is going to be. Now, I would suggest that the defense take a different strategy in the second trial, meaning I would not, if he was my client, I would certainly not encourage Mr. Murdaugh to take the stand. And if he doesn't, I think that is going to make things a lot more difficult for the state to prove. I think that the case was not, locked and thrown away before Alec Murdaugh took the stand. I think, to some degree, he had a major part in the verdict, and that was through his testimony. So if that does not happen, I think the state is going to have an uphill battle, which is really not normal. Usually the state is always at a better advantage knowing, what loopholes they missed the first time or what witnesses maybe didn't get the evidence across in the way they wanted to. They have time to go back and prep that witness, get their exhibits in a better way. And keep in mind, this case is so massive. And the way Creighton Waters had to tie it all together, you can't leave out the financial part of it because that's the motive to the murder. And so there has to be enough of a story told that doesn't confuse the jurors, doesn't bore them, and is easy to understand to put all into this picture. And I still think that the average person, even after hearing all of that evidence and having it presented in the best way, we struggle, can a man murder his wife and his son? And that is still going to be in the minds of every juror if we do have a second trial. So I think the strategy from both sides is going to be very different. And we might even see some new lawyers at play on both sides. We'll see.
When you mentioned the decision by Alec Murdaugh to take the stand, I thought it was very telling during the first trial when Attorney Jim Griffin, the way that he phrased it, he didn't say the defense calls Alec Murdaugh. He said that the defendant wishes to take the stand. It was pretty clear that he was advised not to do that by his counsel. He did it anyway, ended up backfiring pretty spectacularly. And you mentioned Creighton Waters a moment ago. What a masterful job he did. Some say the financial component of it was belabored a bit, but this is a guy who literally stuck the landing on a very difficult case. Lauren, what kind of pressure is he facing to stick the landing if we got to do this a second time? Is it something you can duplicate?
It's absolutely something you can duplicate, because I think, a lot of Creighton's success was in his passion, right? And when you just straight up called him a family annihilator, like, let's get to the point of this, because all these jurors are sitting here thinking that no person would murder their family. And when we get to the heart of it, he needs to paint Alex Murdaugh as a desperate, drug-addicted sociopath who is willing to do whatever needs to be done to meet the end. That is what he needs to get out of whatever lie he's told now. So I think that is going to be the heart of it. Now, when Alec took the stand and, kind of gave the jurors the show that Creighton had been painting the picture of, that made Creighton's job a little bit easier. I think he could kind of kick his feet back and be like, see, I told you, like, he's lying to you guys right now. Without that, it's going to be a lot more of playing on the jurors' emotions. Can you get them over that finish line to where they see that gun in his hand, they see how the night went, and they can, go to sleep at night and know that they convicted a man who did in fact commit the crime.
When you mentioned Dick Harpootlian earlier in the interview, we obviously sat down with him earlier this month. He was extremely optimistic that the state Supreme Court was going to award Alec Murdaugh a new trial. In fact, he then subsequently gave an interview with Seton Tucker over at Impact of Influence, even more bullish on the prospect for his client Alec Murdaugh to receive a new trial. But let me ask you this, Lauren, assuming Murdaugh is unsuccessful before the South Carolina State Supreme Court, which I think is still a possibility. As you mentioned, a lot of folks just want this to go away in the South Carolina legal community. It's been a huge black eye for South Carolina's attorneys, for the justice system. A lot of folks want it to go away. But assuming the Supreme Court doesn't give him a new trial, Murdaugh still has a very viable avenue to pursue at the federal level. Isn't that correct?
Yes, he does. And I mean, that could still render the same situation here. So I think the state issue is where, Dick is going to say it's got to happen. It's got to happen. That's what, he gets paid to do. So I think that they are definitely using the embarrassment of this case and the embarrassment that Becky Hill has brought not only upon her office, but upon our state as further leverage. And I think they're going to get that leverage a lot easier through the South Carolina State Supreme Court than they would taking the federal level. So I would see a lot of steam slow down once South Carolina Supreme Court has made their decision, if they do decide to deny the retrial request. I think they'll still pursue it on the federal basis, but I think their best shot right now is kind of using the outrage and, all of this stuff to fuel their argument. And I think that's much more impactful on the state level than it would be in the federal level.
Well, we are still without a timetable at the state level. The Murdoch appeal was filed back in December. We are still waiting for the state of South Carolina to respond. They have requested not one, but two extensions on their response to Murdoch's appeal. In fact, Murdoch's attorneys have called them out for stalling on the case. And Attorney Joe McCulloch, you mentioned him earlier, he's even been more aggressive, calling out SLED's investigation, saying that it is essentially an effort to protect this verdict as opposed to find the truth related to this saga. But Lauren, when we do get a hearing on this, I hope you will join us. I hope you'll be out front of the courthouse with us again, because we were dealing with some incredibly tricky issues last time, and the way you broke down those different cases and what the standards were really helped our audience understand what was going on and exactly what Justice Stoll was looking at in that hearing. Would you be willing to join us when that?
Oh, happy to help. I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting day in the state. Wouldn't miss it.
All right, that was Lauren Taylor with Lauren Taylor Law. So glad to have her back in the fold, helping us analyze these complex issues as the Murdaugh appeal drama rolls forward. Be on the lookout, by the way, for that full interview with Lauren Taylor. We're going to drop that early next week. She gets into some other cases, including one I'm not personally read into, but is getting all the traffic nationwide, the Diddy case. Lauren's going to walk us through some details on that case that are going to blow your mind. So be on the lookout for that full interview to drop next week. But getting back to the Murdoch saga, I want to bring in our Jen Wood now. Jen, you have been at the forefront of this case from the very beginning. You've been leading our research efforts on it and helping drive our coverage not only of the trial, but of the big evidentiary hearing that Lauren and I were talking about. You have also been driving our coverage of the appeals process, publishing a big report that detailed all of the various facets of Alec Murdaugh's appeal and your thoughts on whether or not he would be successful. You listened to that interview, Jen, with Lauren Taylor. Let me start with you on a very baseline question. Where are you on Alec Murdaugh's appeal? 50% he gets a new trial, 75%, or are you all the way at 100?
I was probably at 50-50 before Becky's arrest. Now I'm more 75.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you though the same thing I asked her. Is this not bizarre that there are no charges against Becky Hill related to the tampering?
Is it bizarre? No, I'm not surprised at all. Are you? I mean,
tell me why.
Because they charge her with the jury tampering, and they are basically giving Alex his new trial.
Yeah.
No, I'm not surprised. I'm sad because I do think that's a miscarriage of justice, but.
Now, two of these charges are tied to events during the trial. One, an obstruction charge that's venued in Colleton County, and then the second, a perjury charge that is venued in Richland County, where Hill allegedly lied when she told former Chief Justice Jean Toll that no media were allowed to view sealed exhibits. Jen, in the days since, we have seen there's a post, I want to pull this up here, from Ben Smith on X, talking about how there was a Dropbox, public Dropbox link with crime scene photos. Jen, what in the world here?
Yeah, I mean, I think how Ben got that link was through the FOIA response for Becky's emails. The link was included in there and remained active until yesterday.
Until yesterday. So let me ask this. There was never a proper order from the beginning to seal these files because, again, they had to go in afterward and fix that after the trial. It was May, I believe, of 2023. They finally got around to formally sealing all of these files. But you're telling me that until this week, the graphic crime scene photos from this investigation were publicly accessible on a Dropbox link?
Yes, there was sealed evidence within that link.
Unbelievable.
And you know, that certainly wasn't mentioned in any of those indictments either. Did SLED know about that?
Unbelievable. Well, I guess they know about it now, so we'll see if they start digging on it or not. But that raises another question, Jen. And again, we've been critical of SLED in this process. We've been critical of the Attorney General's office. We have suggested that there is a massive effort to preserve this verdict. And I guess, let me throw the question to you this way. Is that understandable? Is that something that, I mean, can we see where they're coming from on this?
That's a tough question because, you know, Alec Murdoch is utterly reprehensible. You know, he is in prison where he belongs. But in terms of preserving a verdict, did Alec Murdoch get a fair trial? No, I do not think he did. I think that is very clear at this point. I think there was a lot going on behind the scenes. I think the whole process is in question, and preserving that verdict should not outweigh justice, true justice, a fair trial.
Yeah, indeed. And I think Lauren Taylor's echoing some of those thoughts in her comments earlier. She was very insightful in her analysis of this. And again, we went back with her all the way to the January 2024 hearing where she helped break down some of those court cases. Jen, as this thing moves forward, I want to ask you a question I asked Lauren as well. If the state Supreme Court here in South Carolina determines that Alec Murdoch is not deserving of a new trial, which is very much in the realm of possibility because, as I mentioned to her, people just want this to go away. The legal community here wants to be done with the Murdochs. But assuming the state Supreme Court does not give him a new trial, do you think his chances are better federally on a habeas corpus motion to get a new trial that way?
I do. I mean, we've got It comes down to the testimony of these key witnesses, one of whom is Becky Hill, the former clerk of court, and clearly her perjury charge kind of makes her testimony come into question. So, I mean, who are you going to believe?
Yeah, exactly. And how do you put her forward as a credible voice saying there was no jury tampering when you're simultaneously prosecuting her for perjury in another matter? It just doesn't seem to add up. But Jen, I want to ask you a bottom line question about Becky Hill. We've gotten some criticism this week from certain folks arguing that, you know, we lack credibility because we were too pro Becky at the beginning. And I guess the question I got to ask is, who at the beginning wasn't pro Becky?
I was going to say it would have been impossible not to be pro Becky. I mean, she was friendly, she was professional, she was helpful. She always answered our questions quickly. I was very impressed with her initially, and I remember when Dick and Jim filed that first motion in September of 2024. My jaw dropped. I mean, I was like, what is happening? And then, you look back at things and you're like, well, she was friendly with the media. She put herself out there. Her face was very publicly visible. And as things evolved, everything kind of got less and less surprising as more and more was revealed.
Jen, we are obviously now in a situation in the court of public opinion anyway, where the prospect for Alec Murdaugh receiving a new trial, the belief that he will get a new trial, is soaring in the aftermath of Becky Hill's arrest on these various charges. But I want to talk about a case that you have been covering extensively for several months now, spent a lot of time in the South Carolina upstate speaking to the people who are living and breathing this story. I'm referring, of course, to the murder of 20-year-old Jessica Barnes of Pendleton, South Carolina. 3 people have been charged in connection with her murder. Her husband, Brandon Barnes, charged with murder. 2 other women who were living in a small pool house with the couple have been charged with multiple crimes related to her death. But Jen, this is just a horrific story. You've been covering extensive details about it, but this week you published a story about an interview with Brandon Barnes that was conducted by our good friend Troy Stiles with Blunt Force Media there in the upstate. And this is the second part of an interview that he conducted with Brandon Barnes, and then in the second interview with the 2 young women, Victoria Tippett and Kendall Mims, who are accused of conspiring with him in the murder of Jessica Barnes. We hear a lot about killers, Jen. We see them in court a lot. We rarely see them take the stand. We saw it in the Murdoch case. But in this case, we are hearing a side of this story that is truly chilling, because it's an interview with Brandon Barnes and his 2 alleged accomplices just days before they were arrested and charged in connection with this crime. So they are still free. They are walking around. It was conducted in the town square there in Pendleton by Troy. Jen, set up this clip that we're getting ready to listen to in connection with this Brandon Barnes case.
So, yeah, this was a truly interesting and bizarre interview that you don't hear often from individuals who are under suspicion of, the wife's missing and they are under heavy suspicion regarding her disappearance. I think it was really interesting listening to Brandon Barnes along with Victoria Tippett and Kendall Mims in a lot of aspects, because, if what the state is alleging is true and he did murder Jessica and they helped dispose of the body, they are out hanging up posters and acting like nothing was wrong. They're giggling, they're talking about their future plans. It was really bizarre to listen to. So, hearing them, I think this first clip we'll go to is, hearing them talking about, how everybody in town, how they're under the watch of everybody in town. All the police know who they are. It's almost kind of like they're enjoying the notoriety momentarily. It is absolutely bizarre.
Well, let's take a quick listen to that clip where they talk about how all the police know who they are and how they're actively surveilled, it sounds like. Let's take a listen.
Yeah, we were walking over here and there's 3 cops over there just sitting at a table.
Yeah.
They were sitting there eating and just like watched us as we walked past
Well, they don't know who you are, do they?
them. Yes.
Oh, do they?
Oh, all the cops know who we are by now. Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. Because y'all look way different than your pictures. Even you, like, y'all look way different than your pictures. Yeah, I was kind of shocked, like, last night that I did recognize who you were. I just thought you were 2 random people.
No. I mean, sometimes, like, even when we walk coming down here, we have people, like, going past our house, back and forth, staring at us, watching us. Even the neighbors really going in circles, just staring at us. Oh, yeah.
Okay, are y'all just paranoid?
No. Because they literally pull out of their house, go around, stare at our house for a bit, and go back to their house and park.
I mean, I've been over there. I know it's all dead-end streets.
Yeah. No, because we have a car that we parked out there. We're writing on the windows,
I
like the price for it.
I
Trying
also
to
saw
sell
the
a
statement
car.
how they found our phone.
Now, Jen, there's another clip in this interview that is pretty chilling, and it refers to shortly after the search warrant was executed by officers of the Pendleton Police Department and agents of the State Law Enforcement Division who assisted in this investigation. But this refers to a search of the premises of the pool house where these 4 folks were living at the time Jessica Barnes was murdered, the place where she was in fact murdered according to police. And just a chilling excerpt from this interview. Set this up, Jen.
Right. So, this search happened days before this interview, and they are talking about how, their house was torn apart by officers. They talk about how a substance, which, you and I know likely was luminol or a substance like that, that was sprayed all over the inside of the pool house, and how the whole inside lit up blue. If you know a lot about crime scene investigation, that indicates it's reacting with blood.
Yeah, let's take a listen to that clip.
They put blue stains all over.
Oh, is this the car they put that in?
Yeah, if we would still be here, they would do it to that car too.
Yeah. It's been all cleaned out.
That would mess up that car.
Is that the blood stuff that makes the blood come
It's
to the
called,
light?
urinal or something.
Is that where you were talking about all the blood stains or something?
Yeah, well, they thought they were fine.
Fucking nothing. They even did it to my ceiling. So.
To your ceiling?
To my
The ceiling of the shower.
I'll take you to my house right now and show you the ceiling they did it to. It's fucked. It's fucked.
Wow.
They almost tried to do it to the old man's new cars. He said, fuck no. Those are new cars.
Well, you gotta think, I put her in her seat to show you.
That's weird.
Yeah.
I mean, the ceiling.
Yes, what I questioned. The ceiling.
Because you can't really clean a ceiling.
No, it's on the ceiling of the shower.
If you got blood on a ceiling,
I'll send you a picture.
it'd be like a bloody
I
ceiling.
don't know, it's all over the shower curtain, all over the sink. We thought we cleaned it off the sink. No.
It was weird because when we went to the detail, it's weird. It's toxic. I had to put her and the baby next door.
You can smell it?
When we walked in the house, we could smell it. We had to get a carpet cleaner because it was like all over the carpet.
So Jen, obviously the details of this crime are graphic: strangulation, dismemberment, removing parts of a body and then burning them. Desecration, in fact, is one of the charges in connection with Jessica Barnes' murder. Just horrific, but there's also a story associated with this case that for some will be even more horrific, and that is what happened to Jessica Barnes' child when she was pregnant, her unborn child. This was something that we have hinted at in some of our coverage, but you have found some documents related to this part of this tragic story. Jen, walk us through what you uncovered regarding Jessica Barnes' pregnancy and what happened with that.
Right. So we did, Troy Stiles and I, who is at Law Enforcement Media and did that interview, have been working really closely together on this and did a FOIA for incident reports in Anderson County involving Jessica and Brandon Barnes. And boy, oh boy, did we get quite the response back. There were a number of calls to the pool house alleging domestic violence. Some in October and December of 2023, where individuals called because, they had seen photos of Jessica with black eyes, and they were concerned, and police went and checked. Jessica didn't want to participate in the investigation, but the one, like you said, that was just absolutely heartbreaking was from April of 2024, when Jessica gave birth to a stillborn child. And the doctors and nursing staff at Oconee Memorial Hospital were so confused with the signs of abuse that they saw that they called in investigators, and they did do an autopsy on the infant. The infant was born 3 to 4 weeks early, and Jessica had clear signs of physical abuse on her, and they did the investigation. There were no charges filed, though, because Jessica continued to deny physical abuse, and she claims she killed the baby because she accidentally bumped into the couch hard. The doctors all said, that would not cause that. That is not something that, because, stomach acts as a buffer for the uterus, a safety zone for the uterus. So the doctor said that, but without any cooperation. The autopsy didn't reveal any visible injuries to the child or her placenta, so there were no charges filed. So yeah, the investigation very clearly was there. They had their suspicions, but no charges filed.
It's just a gut-wrenching tale. So many victims. Obviously, Jessica Barnes at the center of it. Her death, her murder is the reason we're all focused on this case, but there's so many other lives impacted by it. We just addressed one of them, certainly in the interview that we just listened to. In some of the excerpts, I remember hearing Brandon Barnes' other child, the child he had with Kendall Mims, crying in the background. And you just think about that child's life. You think about the lives of those two girls. Obviously, Kendall Mims' attorney, Catherine Weiss, has said in open court that she is another one of Brandon Barnes' victims.
And if you listen to that interview very closely, you hear, a lot of control that Brandon had over those girls. It was very evident in listening to it. Does it excuse her actions? Absolutely not. But I do think it plays a huge factor into what happened. And looking at these incident reports, you see that, within Jessica and Brandon's relationship. So there's a lot of elements of physical abuse, but as well as coercive control and mental abuse in this case. I was listening to broadcasters talk about the Diddy trial and why his girlfriend never left him. And, as an expert in domestic violence, said you have to remember leaving is not easy. It is the most dangerous time in a relationship, an abusive relationship. It's when you are most likely to lose your life as a result of domestic violence. And, a lot of times, with like the Diddy case, his girlfriend, Cassie, he was paying for her apartment and would drop in unexpectedly and would send people searching for her if she went missing. You see that in this case too, clearly the money was keeping those girls there, but you do see a lot of that in these reports where, he calls after the police show up after one domestic violence call and asks the police what he's doing there, what they were doing there. Mm-hmm. So clearly, he had a lot of control over what was going in that house. It's frightening.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is one of the things I referenced earlier, that Lauren and I talked about the Diddy case extensively in that big interview that's going to drop next week, and that was one of the things we discussed. So look forward to hearing that perspective on it as well, because you're right, that's a difficult thing to do. It sounds so simple, just walk away, but it is a lot more complicated than that, Jen. I'm glad you brought that out and pointed that out. Obviously, this case is one that we're going to cover intensively over the coming weeks, and it's crazy, Jen. So many of these stories, they start with us. We cover them, whether it's Murdaugh, Rose Petal, that big murder trial that we covered earlier this year up in Greenville. So many of them start with us, and then they explode into these national stories. And so, I certainly hope, a lot of folks don't like it when that happens. They want to try and own these stories, but frankly, I think it's important for that broader attention, that broader spotlight to be shined on these cases, because again, this story, the Jessica Barnes saga, just so many victims, so many layers, and your work on it, Jen, I think is going to pave the way for a lot of people who cover it in the future, and just can't thank you enough for your work on it, Jen.
Of course, thank you, Will.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for this week's edition of the show. I want to thank our entire news team, especially Andy Fancher, who is standing in for Dylan Nolan, who usually produces the show. Dylan's off this week. A ton coming in this next week, folks. We're dropping that big interview with Lauren Taylor, so be on the lookout for that. And once again, your support drives everything that we do here. It's you who empower these lights, these cameras, the action we cover. Your subscriptions are what make all of it possible. So if you haven't already, please, I would encourage you, subscribe today to FITSNews.com. Thanks again, and we will catch you next time on The Week in Review.